Welcome back, viewers, as we pick up our conversation with John Lane. John and I are practicing an extreme form of social distancing. John's coming to us from Australia. I'm here in the good old USA. John, how are you doing today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Louis. Yep, very well. Louis, do you have enough toilet paper?
Yes, I do. And I actually have a
Okay.
whole stack of undistributed newspapers here too, if it gets extreme. So I'll be okay, I think.
The shops here. I was asking one of my daughters tonight. The shops here still don't have any toilet paper. The shelves are empty as soon as they fill them. It's like, how much of this stuff can you stock? Can you store?
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Meat's not on the counters. We're living in some crazy times right now, aren't we? And we're still, I don't know what your situation is there, but no Holy Mass here. I went to.
No, we. Yep. Yep.
One of the things that I find extremely frustrating, and we're going to get into our regular conversation in a moment, is this. It's stunning to me the degree to which even traditional Catholic clergy don't seem to comprehend the idea that the civil power simply does not have the right nor the authority to dictate to the Catholic Church when and where she can have Holy Mass. In the carrying out of her duty for the salvation of souls, the state has no authority over the Church. Correct?
Yes, of course. But I think if you just so if you were a traditionalist priest, particularly a Society of St. Pius X priest or a Sedevacantist priest, you'd be thinking, we are so far from being able to be on the front foot about this stuff. We're lucky to be left alone at the moment, and we just need to hold fast. So I think that I saw your post where you said, this is a teaching moment that's been missed, and that's a fair comment. But I think your typical traditionalist priest would probably be thinking, man, we have so many more urgent, proximate things to deal with than to worry about that. That's probably, I think, what they'd be thinking. They're just wanting to, the boat's half swamped and they're all just trying to stay on board.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just move on from there. Yesterday, the Archbishop of Toronto, Cardinal Collins, put out a thing, and he made it clear that we're not having Mass, and the reason is because the government said we can't. And I find that most unfortunate. It would be far more Catholic to say, we're not having Mass because I've decided it's the prudent thing to do. Yes. By virtue of my charge to take care of the souls in my diocese. Yes. At any rate, let's move into our regular conversations here, John. We left off last time, just briefly started to touch on the idea of indefectibility in the Church. And I want to begin with a quote from the 1917 Catholic Encyclopedia and its treatment of indefectibility. And it says, the promise of indefectibility is made to the corporate body. Individual churches may become corrupt in morals, may fall into heresy, may even apostatize. And then it goes on to say, only to one particular church is indefectibility assured, to the See of Rome, to the Roman Church. As St. Cyprian says, faithlessness cannot gain access. Pope Leo XIII wrote also on this topic in Sadis Cognitum on the unity of the Church. And speaking of the Roman Church, he also quoted St. Cyprian. And he writes, St. Cyprian says of the Roman Church that, quote, it is the root and mother of the Catholic Church, the chair of Peter, and the principal church, whence sacerdotal unity has its source. And the Holy Father then goes on to say, the Roman Church is the efficient cause of unity in the Christian commonwealth. And he also writes in this same encyclical of the Church always visible. So this is something that I wrestle with personally. We have talk here about the Roman Church, the See of Rome. This to me sounds like the Diocese of Rome.
Yep.
And it's called the efficient cause of unity, and it's always visible. And so my question is, where is this See of Rome? When I look to Rome today, what I see is a hotbed of heresy. I don't see the efficient cause of unity and faith. So where is the Roman Church, and where is the Church in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in a sense, we know where the church is because converts keep finding her, and we go to mass ourselves at chapels that we believe to be chapels of the Catholic Church, and so it's not so much a question of where is the church, it's more where isn't the church. So, because the traditionalist, within the traditionalist milieu, I think everybody would probably agree with what I've just said. I would say that the difference between myself and a Serie planist traditionalist is that I'm frankly admitting I have no relation with those with the heresiarchs, and they are claiming, contrary to their own daily actions, to have a relation with those men. So they're calling Francis Pope, but they don't mean it. It's an empty verbiage. It literally is something that cannot be, in philosophical terms, reduced to act. You can say he's Pope, but it's impossible to actually treat him as Pope. So as the approximate rule of faith and as your rule of communion, to be in the church, you have to be united with Francis. Well, they don't believe that. The only ones who might believe it are those who believe the lie that the Sedevacanists or the traditionalists, perhaps, as a whole, are schismatics. If somebody actually believes that, then they possibly can believe that to be in union with Francis in some realistic way is required to be in the church. But other than that type of person, and that's sort of your neo-cath mentality, I would say, nobody believes that. Everybody treats union with Francis of any kind as a sort of at best, a provisional or a conditional position that we take. And that's the position the Archbishop took. People say he wasn't a Sedevacanist. Actually, I think he was in the end. De Castro-Mayer certainly was. And he'd been trying to convince Lefebvre to make a public declaration of what he knew Lefebvre's own private conviction was for years. And Lefebvre was reluctant to make that for reasons of policy. Pastoral reasons, really. I mean, that's where that reluctance came from. He didn't want to create a giant schism. But certainly what the Archbishop wasn't, even if you don't accept what I've just said, he was not an anti-Sedevacanist, because he was openly speculating that he might adopt our view himself. And he stated, and Tissier has confirmed this in writing, that one day the church may judge that these men have not been popes. So, skip forward 50 years, there's another general council. And at that general council, all these men are anathematized, from John the 23rd through, or from Paul VI through, whatever it might be, and declared never to have been true popes, to have been usurpers and heresiarchs. If that's the case, then thinking that they're not popes today, and admitting that that's what you think, is being correct, right? You're right to think that, and the church will one day say, yep, they were right. And I'm not saying the church will one day praise us. Who that's not the point. The point is a question of ontology and epistemology. So the questions of what is the case, and what can be known, and so the position of the Archbishop, at least, certainly was that it is lawful to conclude that the see is vacant. And in fact, he openly speculated that he might conclude that himself. And
John,
he was having conferences.
At this point, though, I'm struck by the tone of the society today with respect to Sedevacantism does not reflect that attitude of the Archbishop in any way. I can recall very well attending one of the Angelus press conferences here in the United States, where one of the conferences given was specifically on the topic of Sedevacantism. And yes, the attitude that I was receiving openly and embracing at the time was that it's not even something that you can possibly entertain. That to entertain it is condemnable. Never mind that it's a possibility, and that you one day may be proven correct that the church may actually judge as much, but it seems to be very different, the tone of the society towards sedevacantism today versus what you're telling us about the attitude of the Archbishop. What do you make of that?
Well, the Archbishop, of course, was he had conferences with his priests in which he was telling them they have to start preparing the minds of the faithful to receive such a declaration of vacancy.
Certainly, he never thought it would go on this long.
No, he didn't, and but yeah. So when we talk about the attitude of the society, I think it's there's the attitude of the Superior General, there's the attitude of the bishops who have a certain moral authority within the society. There's the attitude of the district superior generals in each country. There's the impression you get from reading something like the Angelus, which is not the policy of the Angelus is not dictated by Menzinger, as far as I'm aware. You may know better. I think you'd know Jim Vogel, for example.
Certainly.
And then you've got, so for instance, if we go back over the history of the anti-sedevacantist articles that have been published by the Society or books even, they generally have been, if you like, a private exercise by somebody. So Father Boulet's little booklet, the dossier on sedevacantism, which appeared in the 90s sometime, late 90s, I think, and which I myself wrote a refutation of, was very much his own work and was not sanctioned by anybody. He just saw a need and went to fill it by gathering together some materials. The same thing's true of Mutatis Mutandis of the Italian district, put out their book, Sedevacantism, A False Solution to a Real Problem. That was the Italian district that did that. So whether that was in any way even known to Menzinger when it was done, I don't know. But it doesn't matter. The interesting thing about that is, of course, it admits that there's a real problem in the very title, and it says in the introduction that the society remains open to discussing this question and potential solutions to this problem. That's a far cry from the attitude of many today. Likewise, the attitude of Archbishop Lefebvre was one thing. The attitude of, even at the time that Lefebvre was still alive, the attitude of the Superior General was another thing. I don't know about Father Pagliarani, but my impression so far is that he's less prioristic in his thinking. We'll come back to that idea if you like, and more. He strikes me as more authentically in the stream of Archbishop Lefebvre. So, what he's saying about the new Mass is straight out of it's the doctrine of Archbishop Lefebvre, right? He's condemning the new Mass wholly and entirely. There's no daylight there. There's no room for the new Mass to be rehabilitated in any way. Whereas Bishop Fallet was more inclined to try and say things which might have been in themselves ambiguous, but were obviously aimed at a sort of a pastoral view of people caught up in the Novus Ordo. So he was trying to make things sound softer for those people, so that he was trying to remove barriers for them to come back to tradition. That's what he was doing, and it outraged people in his own society. So these things, anyway. So I agree with you. If you're talking about a matter of emphasis, there's been some change in emphasis over the years. But I also think that you need to look at the individuals involved and see whose agenda is being expressed in any given case. Is it really the society, or is it an individual? The same thing's true of at another level, which is that Anyway, that'll do. I think on that. I mean, I could talk about this all night probably.
Well, I think
tell you more stories.
To be fair, I mean, your own personal experience. You attend a society chapel, and it's a very amicable relationship. You're very much at home there, correct?
I am. I think if I had if I was a political type, or I believed that unless you think Francis isn't Pope, you won't save your soul,
Right.
or something like that.
It wouldn't be so amicable then, would it?
Of course not. That
Right.
I would be regarded as a troublemaker, you know.
Sure.
Yeah. So no, I don't think so. And also these conversations you and I are having could well cause me any amount of trouble because even though I'm not a troublemaker, as I learned when I first became a sedevacantist, as I told you in relation to my father-in-law, there are people out there who will make trouble for you if they can. So I took the liberty of emailing many senior members of the society a link to our videos and saying, I'm sending this to you as a courtesy so that you hear it from me and not from someone else, to try and, if possible, cut off the possibility of others causing trouble, because they will, you know, take things out of context. There'll be people who say, I said things in these conversations that I didn't say, and you can check the video and they'll still say that.
Yeah.
That's how it is. You know?
Probably a good idea for you to put out that preemptive defense, you know, good idea. So John, let's get back to this idea of, you know, where is the Roman Church? I mean, you said that it's, you know, in part, you could frame the question in terms of, we know where it isn't. And so I look to Rome today, and it's clear to me that institution in Rome under the headship of this man, Jorge Bergoglio, that's not Holy Mother Church. That's not the See of Rome into which faithlessness cannot gain access. Clearly, faithlessness abounds in conciliar Rome today, no question about it. You know, getting to where it is, in my own personal struggle to find it, I read a quote from Cardinal Manning that said something along the lines of the church and vis-a-vis her visibility, that towards the end of time it may come to more closely resemble the very early church. It seems to me there must be, I don't have the answer to this question myself. When I ask you where is the See of Rome, I'm not just throwing a question out there for the edification of others. I'm trying to educate myself. But one of the things that I'm trying to flesh out in my mind is the idea that maybe there's a mystical, something mysterious about the enduring visibility of this church. So I'm thinking of Cardinal Manning. The church was certainly visible in the earliest days. It was certainly indefectible in its earliest days. But a believer in some other part of the world may not have been able to physically lay eyes on this thing and say, there it is, there's the visible church. So do you think there's some sort of mystery there? And not to go on too much, but a smart and good friend of mine related this, you know, at Fatima, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved in Portugal.
Yeah.
So you look at Portugal, it's a mess doctrinally. The chapel there, I mean, it's a mess. It's an abomination. It's hardly an edifying structure. So we have to believe Our Lady was telling the truth when she said the dogma of the faith would always be preserved in Portugal. And yet, for you and I to look there must be some mysterious aspect to this question. Where is this See of Rome? So I don't know. I want you to go on about that just a little bit more. Where is it? This visible church.
Yeah, on the Fatima quote, of course, that's a half sentence, isn't it? At the end of the second part of the secret.
Right, there's an etc. and then what follows is hidden from us. Because
that the formulation, that isn't a complete sentence. The formulation is very strange. It's what does it mean, the dogma of the faith? You know, does it mean the dogmas of the faith? So everything that's essential to the faith will be preserved in Portugal. And as you say, the situation in Portugal hardly seems to support that, the truth of that statement. Or is it a statement such as, you know, that's made conditional by what comes after it or something? Yeah. So
we just don't know.
The dogma of the faith will always be preserved in Portugal. You know, if these things are done. We literally don't know. We've got a half a sentence. We don't know. So I just take nothing from that. But I take your point that I see the parallel you're drawing. Okay, so when we talk about visibility, the visibility of the church, we're talking about the objective visibility of the church. So the fact that she's visible for what she is in herself. Okay, so you know, I'm looking at a vase right now, which is over here. It's objectively visible. You can't see it. Nobody else can. There's probably not another soul in the world, because I'm in a room and there's no one else nearby. There's probably not another soul in the world that can see that, even if they look. And this was the case, as you rightly point out, with the church in the upper room on Pentecost. That the entire church was contained within four walls. It was perfectly visible, but it was not. It was objectively visible, but subjectively it was not seen by many. It was only seen by her own members at that stage. And then, of course, they went out into the street. St. Peter started preaching, and suddenly the church was visible to others as well. But again, only to those in Jerusalem on that day. So that much is clear. The second thing is that I would just distinguish, or at least draw out, two different ways of understanding the notion of that's not the church. When we say that's not the church, we may mean that the body that we see is not the church. Like if you look at something like a Greek schismatic sect, you say that's not the church. It's not part of the church. Or a Lutheran congregation, that's not the church. We're not looking at the church if we're looking at a Lutheran congregation. When we look at a Catholic parish, let's just make this easier so that we don't have to explain everything. We don't have to make all these distinctions all the time. Let's imagine we're looking at the church in 1955. So we're looking at a Catholic parish anywhere in the world, and we say, well, that's the church. That's the Catholic Church. We don't mean that's the whole church, but we do mean that's part of the church. That is an authentic part of the church. I'm seeing the church if I see that. And so there's that distinction between what is the church, what isn't the church, and then there's when we say that's not the church, we really mean that's not the church speaking or acting, and we're talking about those acts such as the documents of Vatican II. And so Archbishop Lefebvre himself said in his reaction to so this was on the floor of the council. It's in his book of interventions at the council, which is entitled "I Accuse the Council," and I think it might have had a different title in English more recently. I think so. They may have renamed it when republishing it, but it doesn't matter. In talking about religious liberty, I think it is, he says, this is not the voice of the Catholic Church. It is not a voice we recognize. It's a voice of someone else, perhaps that of the serpent. Now, he knew that text was accepted by the council and promulgated by Paul VI in December 65. And yet in the 70s, when he republished his interventions on the council floor, he didn't change that text. And he continued for his entire life to reject that text as not coming from the Catholic Church. Now, how he reconciled that with the fact that it was, the words of an ecumenical council, apparently, we can leave aside. What's interesting is that he was saying that's not the church speaking. Yeah. So when we talk about when Sedevacana, certainly when we say that's not the church, we're actually talking about the Novus Ordo Church. We primarily mean the second of those, right? We mean it doesn't. The official acts of that church are not the official acts of the Catholic Church. We secondarily can mean, depending on the individual using the term, that the body of faithful and the clergy, that's not the Catholic Church either, and someone like Bishop Sanborn, who says that the SSPX is at least objectively schismatic, he would seem to be seeing things that way, that thinking that, well, basically the sedevacantist are the Catholics left in the world. I don't agree with that. I think that's just wrong. But I think it's important to bring these things out and to state them so that we know what we mean when we're discussing it. That's all. So if we're talking about the Diocese of Rome, yes, the local Church of Rome is indefectible. No other individual church. So when we say individual church, we mean diocese. No other individual church in the entire universal church is indefectible. Any of them can defect, and many of them have. So this means that, what does this mean? It means that the Diocese of Rome, so the Bishop of Rome can't be a heretic. So if there's a heretic claiming to be Bishop of Rome, then he's not the Bishop of Rome, really, because he would be engaging that church. He would be engaging that church's authority in his pronouncements and in his official acts, and he would be making it a defective church, a church of heresy, an error. Yeah. A more profound problem occurs when we look at the liturgy. If we take the view that the traditionalists generally take of the new Mass, which is that it's actually bad. It's not just less good. It's a positively bad form of worship. Then how do we find the remaining church that's not defected in Rome, unless there's traditional masses going on in Rome? Now, there probably are and probably have been all through. But, you talk about visibility, they haven't been the most visible thing in Rome. So to sum it up, I would say that if we think about how theologians will explain what happened during our time afterwards, I think they will be focusing on the first of those ways of saying that something's not the church, and that is the official acts. If we decapitate the Church of Rome, so to speak, in other words, if we posit the hypothesis that these men have not been true popes and therefore not true bishops of Rome, then we escape a lot of bad consequences theologically. Yeah,
I can see that.
Yeah, you're still faced with the problem of saying, well, where was the body of faithful and clergy that remained faithful through the crisis in Rome? And I think that will be easier afterwards than it is today. Certainly for me. I mean, I'm not familiar with Rome. I've been there once. I'd love to spend lots of time in Rome and get to know lots of people there and understand what the whole dynamic is. But I don't have that privilege. But it would be interesting for sure to see, to get to know the local church in Rome, if you like.
Well, John, I think you presented a pretty good way to think about this when you're talking about the vase that you can see. It's objectively visible. You know that. You're sitting there looking at it. But subjectively, it's not visible to me. And so I think if we think of the church that's indefectible and visible in the See of Rome, that could be taken to mean everywhere that the faith is truly held and the true Mass is celebrated and faithlessness has not gained access, that it's objectively visible, and we take it on faith that it is, because it's a dogma of our faith that the church is indefectible and visible till the end of time. But subjectively, we may have trouble finding it. On this notion of separating the actions of this institution of Rome and its acts from the institution itself, I can see where that would have had a little bit more appeal maybe 40 years ago. But year by year and decade by decade, this institution continually puts out things and engages in acts that simply are not Catholic. And so I have a lot of difficulty separating the acts from the institution, to the point where maybe we'll get into this more deeply in an entire episode, this whole concept of the conciliar church. and how it is a visible society all its own that's quite
Yes.
unlike the visible society of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And I tend to think of that institution as overshadowing the true church. But to move on, I want to jump into, I wasn't going to do this right away, but this might be a good time to do it. I want to jump into some of the viewer questions that we received via email. And on that note, viewers, I want to just briefly say to you, number one, thank you. We've got a great deal of response to that invitation to email your questions to us, and we really appreciate it. Please don't have your feelings hurt or feel slighted if you don't get a personal reply from us saying, got your question, thank you very much. Just be assured, we appreciate it. But there's too many of them coming in to refer to specifically and to respond to personally. So one of the questions that came in, a viewer asked me to kind of explain myself, where I had said, probably in episode 1, that while I'm utterly convinced that this Francis person is an anti-pope and is not a true pope of the Catholic Church, and yet I said that I'm not a sedevacantist, properly speaking. And what I mean by that is I think that Francis is unique among the post-conciliar claimants to the papacy. All of those men had a great deal of pushback. But Francis, it seems to me, the way in which he was engaged and admonished and challenged is unique. I mean, it meets the standard that's set in the letter to Titus, where a man must be admonished. After the first and second warning, he shows himself to be a heretic and therefore separated himself from the body of the church. So I think he's unique in that sense, and I don't know that we can apply that same standard to the popes that preceded him. And that leads to a question for you, John, about what do you think of John the 23rd? Evidently, you think that he was an invalid pope, but why do you think that?
I'm looking at the whole situation and saying, how do we explain what happened to the Catholic Church? And I'm probably looking at it in a imaginatively, if you like, from 50 years in the future, looking back on it. I think that's a valuable thing to do, just as an exercise, to imagine. So think about the Great Western Schism. You know, when you're in the middle of it in 1390, how it might end. Well, there were lots of theories about how to end it. You know, we had the Council of Pisa, which just made it worse, gave us a third pope. How it might end was just anybody's question. But it did end in the end. And then the job of the theologians was to sort through the debris, if you like, and the facts, and just say, well, okay, here's what seems to have actually happened theologically through this period. So so that's sort of how I look at it now. And I did at our crisis, I think, well, you know, what preserves the truths of our faith through this period? Yeah. So I think it's much easier to preserve a belief in the indefectibility of the Church without John the 23rd as Pope than with him as Pope, if you can see what I'm saying there. That's the first thing. The second thing is that he didn't just govern badly, or he wasn't just remiss in his duties. He announced a policy which was contrary to the policy of the Catholic Church. It was incompatible with the primary purpose of the papacy, which is to preserve the faith. And then he executed that policy. So I'm saying I think that in his case that in itself was a heresy, yeah, and it was a very public heresy because it was an announced policy. So yeah, does that start to answer the question?
It does. I think you're saying that by his actions, he demonstrated that he's not Pope.
He did. He demonstrated that he didn't have the faith. Now, how he became, where he came from is a very interesting question. I mean, it's a matter of history, right? And I've done a fair bit of reading about this, and he's a very mysterious character, Louis. Indeed. he knew he was going to be Pope when he went into the conclave, but he put out the story that he'd bought a return ticket on the train to Venice, thinking that there was no chance. He was not only Papabile, but Cardinal Ottaviani and maybe Ruffini, I can't remember who the second one was, went and saw him in his cell before the conclave started. So after they'd moved into their cells, but before the official start of the conclave, they went and visited him in his cell to sound him out, because he was Papabile. It was recorded in writing several years before the election of Ron Kelly that he would be the next pope, and that we would have a council.
Yeah, I remember reading that, and then it was contradicted later. Like John the 23rd, when he announced his intention to convoke this council, he's speaking to some cardinals in Rome, and he acted like it was just an on-the-spot illumination from the Holy Ghost to call a council.
He said it
when
was.
It's something, right, he said that it was, and yet prior to being elected, he made it plain to others that it was his intention to call a council if he became Pope. So,
well, that's what
he was duplicitous, you have to say.
Well, De Mattei reports that if you consult his diary, he has this revelation about Vatican, about calling the council, but he puts it on 2 different days, like a week apart.
Right.
So his own diary is not a contemporaneous record; it's like a reconstruction, and he's forgotten that he's already put it in there, and he adds it in later.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was a very duplicitous character, yeah, no doubt. So then you've got the white smoke, black smoke problem in 58 of the conclave.
John, not to interrupt you, but you've anticipated the second part of the question from this same viewer. He wanted you to please comment on this Cardinal Serie theory. And
I can't comment on the Serie theory because Gary Giuffre, bless him, has been promising to put out his book on the subject for decades, and it hasn't come out. So
I'm not familiar with who he is, John. Who is that?
He's the chief researcher and promoter, for want of a better term, of the idea that Cardinal Serie was elected Pope in 58 and that something was done to suppress his papacy. And this explains why we had an anti-Pope emerge from the conclave. Anyway, what I'm saying is that we don't have the data. We don't have the data about what happened in the conclave, and we'll, at some point, all the private diaries and papers of the key players will be exposed. They'll be available to researchers, and we will possibly then be in a position to know what happened. But right now we just don't have the data. Now maybe Gary Giuffre has it, and people close to Gary have seen it, and that's why they're so convinced of the Serie theory. But I'm not, because I haven't seen the evidence, and why would I be convinced of something just because it sounds nice,
Right.
It's still.
John Venari wrote on this, and I remember his take on it, if correctly, hopefully, that he doesn't know what happened, obviously, any more than you and I do, but he hangs his hat, or did hang his hat, on the idea that Serie moving forward didn't behave as Pope. So he gave no indication to the world that he had been elected Pope and emerged from the conclave as such. And I've also read another theory that he was elected but was threatened not to accept. The threats, the speculation is his family being put in jeopardy, and therefore he did not accept. Well, if he didn't accept, he wasn't actually elected. And there, no smoke. It would have been black smoke, of course, because the man that was elected declined to accept the papacy, which is a required part of it. But anyway, moving on, you were speaking of the conclave of 58 before I interrupted you.
Well, so my point about the 58 conclave is it definitely was a very strange event. Now, conclaves are they're big events, and history is compressed, if you like, in these moments. So you might expect a little bit of unusualness in terms of how things happen. But you know, Monsignor Fenton in his diary report Spelly, that's Cardinal Spellman of New York, emerged from the conclave looking white and shaken. And you go, well, why was that so significant that Fenton wrote it down in his diary? You know, Fenton obviously considered that was of some significance, that he recorded it. What did he see? So, you know, what did Spelly see? So yeah, something odd happened in the conclave, but the Serie theory might be right insofar as it shows that the conclave was as dodgy as hell. It may be wrong in claiming that Serie was Pope, because I agree with John Vanari that Cardinal Serie did not act as Pope afterwards, and then he went back to Genoa, and after the council, implemented the council in Genoa, including the new mass.
Right.
So I guess I'm wondering if he was secretly Pope, how did the church benefit from this in any way? If he just went along with the revolution, you know, if he'd been a De Castro Mayer and not introduced the new mass in his diocese, that'd be something. But even that wouldn't do it, because I think if you don't act as Pope, you're not Pope, for a certain period anyway. You know, once it's clear you don't intend to act as Pope, you're not Pope. This is a principle of reason. And it's reflected in canon law in various ways, this principle. For example, if you're a religious and you leave your convent or your monastery, after so many days, you're regarded as an apostate, as someone who has abandoned his post. In canon law, in Canon 188, it says that if you accept an office incompatible with any office you currently hold, yeah, then the one you currently hold, you lose automatically without any declaration.
John, this concept of a religious being a defector, in essence, defecting his post, you know, almost like a soldier. Can we apply that to Benedict XVI in light of, you know, the idea that he remains Pope and that he's going through these motions as if it's, you know, a heroic act to in some ways save the church? We can get into that in more detail in a different episode, but this idea of defecting your post, would that not perhaps apply to someone like Benedict to remove some of the questions about whether or not he remains the true Pope?
Well, on the face of it, yes, because even if you took the view that the resignation was technically invalid, because the wording, and again, so we need to be analysing things in terms of traditional jurisprudence, not legal positivism. Okay, so legal positivism would be wanting to see, you know, some technicality not being followed, and then would regard that as everything. You know, traditional jurisprudence is really the application of sort of crystallized reason to a question. So it takes a broader view and tries to understand, you know, a text in terms of what's its real meaning. You know, so what's that resignation letter saying? And if it were true that the natural reading and the objective meaning, therefore, of the letter of resignation is not that really he resigns, but that he steps aside from actively performing certain actions or something. I don't know what the argument would be. And even so, and then you inferred from that when you say, well, look, this is not really a valid resignation. Fine, that might be able to be proven, might be able to be shown, but then the question would be, what does he do next? He appears to me to have, by his actions, abandoned the post. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that reason would only give you a certain time within which and I don't mean a strict time limit, and it needs to be laid down in canon law. That's legal positivism again, right? And it's not like you have 21 days.
Right. It's that analogy of the beard that you shared with us. There's not a strict time, but over time you can say, hey, that's a beard now, right?
That's it. Exactly. No, that's exactly right. It's the same. It's the same type of problem that you're confronting. This sort of modern mathematical mind. It's used to thinking that physics covers everything and mathematics, and if anything's not like physics and mathematics, it's unknowable. And so I would think, he would not be Pope by virtue of his actions expressing. And Paul VI did the same thing. Paul VI, before I think it was the whole council, ceremonially, I mean, why he did this, probably the subject of books on its own. He ceremonially removed the triple tiara from his own head and placed it on the high altar and made it clear, I'm not wearing this thing anymore. I'm renouncing this.
Right.
If that's not a renunciation of authority in every sense, what is that? What is that action meant to signify?
I agree with you, John. I don't think nearly enough is made of that gesture. Removing the papal tiara and ordering that it be sold and the proceeds go to the poor. I mean, what was he doing there? I think that deserves a lot more explanation.
Yeah. So, yep. So, I mean, and the other thing is, I should say, Louis, that I'm responding to your questions here, and I'm happy to share my views. What I'm not doing is I'm not saying, look, John the 23rd wasn't Pope. You all have to believe that, and here's the proof. I'm telling you why I think, nah, he wasn't Pope. That's what I think. Okay, and so I'm not even sure how I would characterize my own degree of certitude about that fact. You know what I mean? So for example, I think I would die rather than acknowledge Francis as Pope. If I was put in a position where to save my life, I had to say yes, yep, Francis he's the vicar of Christ. I don't honestly think. I mean, I may fail under the trial, but that's a separate question. I'm saying intellectually, I don't think I could say that without a moral fault, without a very grave moral fault, because I don't believe it, and I don't see there's any way to arrive at a different view. Yeah. Whereas with John the 23rd, would I die for that? I don't think so.
Gotcha.
I don't think anything hangs on it really. Yeah.
Well, I think this is one of the things that I'm sure viewers appreciate about your side of this conversation. You're not here to recruit people to your point of view. You're simply sharing it. And hopefully they find it edifying, and I'm certain they do, based on the responses that we're getting, and appreciate that. So, John, talking about along these lines of, that analogy with the beard. So over time, things do change, and the consequences of the circumstance that we find ourselves in changes. So based on your view, starting with John the 23rd, the church has been without a pope, and now we're pressing on into 6 decades or more. Over time, is that not going to result in the disappearance of the hierarchy? And how do we compensate for that? And we had a viewer send us a question along those lines, pointing out that ordinary jurisdiction, governance, can only come from a true pope. Yes. And if one of the marks of apostolic succession is the power to govern, who has it today? And if you can identify that person today, or these persons, or even speak about them in a general sense, if this drags on another 20, 30 years, aren't we going to get to a tipping point where the hierarchy is going to essentially disappear? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no. Well, I agree with that, but I'll just preface the remarks I'm about to make by pointing out that it's always rich. It's always a rich irony, Louis, when people who openly show contempt for the doctrines that are found in the theology manuals, which don't suit them, suddenly find one. Well, they didn't find this one, we did. The continuity of the hierarchy is not something that anti-Sedevacantist came up with. We noticed it, right, as a problem, right, and started to grapple with it in public as we did, and then it was like, oh yeah, hang on, this is a good argument against you guys, right? Yeah, but these people don't believe. So you've got people who are telling us we deny this truth that the hierarchy must always persist in existence, and those same people are openly writing articles in the Remnant saying that the church is not infallible in her general laws, in canon law. Well, that's not even doubtful that the church is infallible in her laws. It's not doubt. It's in every manual. It's in every theologian that the church is. It's completely certain that the church is infallible in her laws. Okay, it's not disputable without mortal sin against the faith. That's the status of that truth. And yet the same people who openly dispute that, or infallibility of canonizations, which is not completely certain to that degree. It actually has a lesser degree of certitude, but it's still common doctrine and still a mortal sin for a layman to be questioning it. Okay? So they openly question the infallibility of canonizations. Something is a mortal sin against faith for them to do, and then they're challenging us to prove something else with it. You couldn't make it up. Hypocrisy is the special mark of our age. It really is. Okay, so let's talk about this problem. Now, the first thing to understand about jurisdiction and heresy, so the loss of office, is we're talking about ordinary jurisdiction, which is a type of habitual jurisdiction. And Cardinal B.O., when he's talking about this question of the loss of office, he's talking about membership in the church, and he's using the loss of office as a given, and then he's using that to argue something else about membership in the church. So he's basically arguing from the loss of office, which is a given, it's a fact, and from that he's showing that, well, if an open heretic automatically loses his office without any declaration, then an open heretic cannot be a member. So in this place, he's proving that open heretics can't be members of the church. That's what he's doing, and he's basing it on the loss of jurisdiction, which is interesting because most people would think that our argument runs the other way, that we have to first show what membership in the church is, and then say, well, what's not a member cannot be head.
Right. And
therefore, yes, but actually B.O.'s arguing the other way, and the reason for that we don't need to get into. It's because there are facts, historical facts. Not just historical facts, they are historical facts, but they're doctrinal declarations, they're definitions really, by the likes of Pope Innocent that tell us that Nestorius lost his office automatically once he started preaching heresy, right? So that's taken as a datum of theology, and then you build on that. Whereas the way anti-sedevacanists argue, that datum of theology is treated as doubtful, and you actually argue away all the traditions of the church until you arrive at showing that, why that datum is doubtful. It's terrible what they do. They argue like Dr. Dollinger, who was Janus at the time of Vatican I. It's horrible. So when B.O. is talking about this issue of loss of jurisdiction, he has a footnote, and he says, we mean only to refer to ordinary jurisdiction in this. So what's lost? Not any other kind of jurisdiction. And this is obvious to anybody who thinks about it for more than a minute, right? Something like that. He's dismissive of anybody who doesn't see immediately that this is important, this distinction. Yeah, we're only talking about ordinary jurisdiction. Now, it's actually the case that most traditionalists who've thought about the Sedevacanist position have assumed, including Sedevacanists, have assumed that a heretic cannot exercise any kind of jurisdiction, delegated, supplied, whatever it might be. This is just wrong. Mm-hmm. It's just not true. And in fact, many theologians say that the church grants supplied jurisdiction to Greek schismatic priests because of common error and or danger of death. Right now, the common error, if common error applies, and Bio is one of them who's, I mean, he's really just reporting the fact that others say this, but he's not objecting to it. And if common error exists, it exists amongst schismatics. It's existing. The common error exists amongst non-Catholics, right? And the jurisdiction is being granted by the Catholic Church to schismatic priests, men who are definitely not Catholics. They may not be guilty of their schism, but they are outside the church, right? They are not members of the church. And the church is granting jurisdiction there. So I think the reason I labour this is because there's this sort of general impression that people have that jurisdiction is. There's nothing wrong with saying jurisdiction is intrinsically incompatible with heresy. Yeah, if all of those terms are understood. So, jurisdiction is intrinsically incompatible with open heresy, but not secret heresy. Yeah, you can maintain jurisdiction, ordinary jurisdiction, even if you're a complete heretic, but you keep it to yourself. Yeah. So that's the first distinction. And the second distinction is we're only talking about ordinary or habitual jurisdiction. So, that being the case, the situation in the church under a false pope is not that all of his acts would be invalid. You know, Archbishop Lefebvre in 76, I think it was, said, you know, it's possible that one day it'll be realised that Paul VI wasn't Pope and all of his acts were invalid. Well, that would not be the case. And Cum ex Apostolatus seems to say that all of the acts of a heretic who was elected Pope, even if he was accepted by the whole Church, none of his acts would be valid. Well, I think that's human law. I think that Paul IV, who wrote and promulgated Cum ex Apostolatus, was trying to make things as difficult as possible for any heretic, Cardinal Morone in this case, who looked like he might be elected as the next pope. He was trying to make things as difficult as possible by erecting as many obstacles. So he was obviously going to word this up and make it as extreme as possible. But that's human law. In divine law, we're only talking about ordinary jurisdiction. So the acts of a heretic who people think is the bishop or the pope would be validated by a supplied jurisdiction insofar as they are for the common good, is how I would summarise it. So the appointment to an office, for example, which requires jurisdiction, it requires jurisdiction to appoint someone to an office, will be validated by supplied jurisdiction. And there's nothing in Cardinal Bio or any of the other manuals that I have seen that would cast doubt on that, and much to support it. I mean, the theologian Wilmers, the theologian Zappalena, Wilmers just says straight out that even the non-popes in the Great Western Schism, the acts that were for the good of souls or for the common good were validated by supplied jurisdiction. And he explicitly says, but not those acts which, such as those by which they excommunicated their opponents. So likewise, we would say we have other arguments in terms of the promulgation of the new Mass, but we could say, well, that was invalid for want of jurisdiction. But the appointment of Father such and such in 1968 to the episcopacy of, City Y was valid by supplied jurisdiction because the candidate was a Catholic. It was good for that city to have a bishop and not have their see to be vacant, etc. Why wouldn't it be valid? So immediately you get a different picture. If you're thinking, well, no bishops could be appointed to office after Pius XII died on the hypothesis that John the 23rd wasn't Pope, then I think that's wrong, and I don't think you can prove that. And I literally have been saying, Louis, for maybe 20 years, I don't know, 15 years, it's been a long, long time. I've been saying to people, tell me what general principle you're applying to get you to where you say there can be no bishops appointed after Pius XII, even on the hypothesis that John XXIII wasn't Pope. Tell me what principle you're applying, you know? Are you saying that anybody who signed Vatican II left the church, or anybody who didn't openly object to Vatican II left the church, so there were no Catholics left in the clergy? Or what are you saying, you know? But I've never had an answer. And I think the answer is, I'm guessing the answer is they just have a simplistic view of jurisdiction, of how this works.
Right, and the distinction between supplied and ordinary. It's really, what I hear you saying is pretty much that simple. Ecclesia supplate. The church still exists. She didn't come down to nothing. She still exists. No, she still acts in the world, and she supplies that jurisdiction. And
yes,
it will eventually become ordinary. So, John, you touched on something that I think we'll pick up on in the next episode. You mentioned an anti-pope appointing a priest to be made a bishop. And that invites questions about the rate of consecration of bishops in the Novus Ordo. And also, of course, more commonly, the rite of ordination to the priesthood in the Novus Ordo rite, and questions of validity. Every Catholic is entitled to sacraments that are not doubtful. And so the question is there room for positive doubt in the new rites of ordination and episcopal consecration? And I'd like to get your opinion on that when we pick this up again in the next episode. What do you think?
Sure.
Sounds good?
Sure.
Great.
Whatever you want to discuss. Whatever you want to discuss, Louis.
Fantastic, John. Be well, and we're looking forward to connecting next week.
Okay, thanks, Louis.